let's start by having a closer look at string interpolation. Here in the server component, I don't want to output this here in the HTML code like this. I don't want to hard code the output here. It would be realistic that our server component contains information about a specific server. So maybe here in the template file, we want to output server with ID and then some dynamic ID here and then the status like offline. So we have two dynamic fields here. Now, it would make sense to kind of derive them in TypeScript code. In a real app, that might be derived from a HTTP request you make to some backend or some calculation. For now, I will hard code it in here. So we might have a server ID, and I will assign a value of, let's say, 10, so a number. And I might also have a server status, which is a string offline. So two different types, a string and a number. And though not necessary, you could also be very explicit by assigning the type with TypeScript's feature here of adding a colon after the property name and then the type. It will infer it automatically though, so this is not required. I'm just doing this here for demo purposes. So now I want to output these two properties in my template. And to get this connection, we need data binding, because you learned it's all about the communication between your TypeScript code and the template. So string interpolation is a typical use case here, or a typical solution for this task here. Instead of the placeholder, I use my double curly braces, opening and closing. This is the string interpolation syntax. And in between these double curly braces, you can now write a TypeScript expression. So the easiest expression is to simply reference a property, like the server ID. And this is a common use case, that you only output a property here, or the value of the property. However, it's not the only use case. You could also, for example, here for server, simply hardcode a string in there. Any expression which can be resolved to a string in the end. That's the only condition for a string interpolation syntax here. So whatever you have between the curly braces, in the end it somehow has to return a string. So you could also call a method here which returns a string in the end. The only other restriction is you can't write multi-line expressions here. You can't write block expressions in here. So you can't add a if or a for control structure in here. You could use a ternary expression though. So this is what you can do. Now let's also replace the last placeholder, and here I will again just reference a property, the server status. Now this is string interpolation in usage, and you see that we have an expression which is a string itself, and then two other expressions which simply point to properties. And again, you could also call a method here which returns a string. Now interesting, the server ID is not a string but a number. And I just said that string interpolation has to resolve to a string in the end, has to get a string in the end. So let's see if this works. If we save this with ngserve still running, let's also change app server back to app servers to make this work again. We see server with ID 10 is offline. We see it twice because we repeat this component, and each component of course has the same content, but we see that string interpolation is working and that it especially is also working here for our number. So ID 10, that is not an issue, that is working fine, because a number can be easily converted into a string. So yes, you have to get a string in the end, or something which can be converted to a string to really be correct here. This is how you can use string interpolation. And now to really complete the example, let's say the server status here is somehow returned in a method. Get server status could be the method name. This is how you define a method in TypeScript. So you might know this kind of method definition from other languages. And here we simply return this server status. So we return the property here. We could of course have accessed as it directly, as we already did, but just to demonstrate that you can call a method, Here I am calling a method, getServerStatus, of course leads to the same output because again, all this method does is it returns us a string in the end or something which can be converted to a string. That is string interpolation in action.